Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the very last delayed session of Torch Club, and welcome you all here. And I think we ought to start right off with guests. So let's start over here. We have some guests over here. Let's start.
I'm Mike Pritchard. I might be a guest. I don't know. I've been in Utah for the last year and a half, afraid to travel, but with wonderful company. My wife, Elaine Engelhardt, who is my guest. And she is a professor of philosophy at Utah Valley University, where she is also the Distinguished Professor of Ethics. That's her official title. So when she says, I'm a distinguished professor, she's not bragging, she's just telling it like it is. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be back here, and I didn't know if I would know anybody, having been away so long, but I know a lot of you, and I've always appreciated knowing you, so thank you.
As the undistinguished leader of this thing right now, we have anybody over here?
I have two guests tonight. First is my wife, Linda. I have to say first. First is my wife, Linda, who's been at Torch before, and our next door neighbor, Monica, who is an artist and avid landscape designer. She's tearing apart her whole backyard, and but it looks good. But it looks good, and she's planning to take a trip to do the Camino, and so when she found out, she thought it would be kind of fun to hear the talk tonight.
And over here, where is our distinguished neurologist?
This is Valerie Flagler. I'm understudying for her husband, David.
I'm not going to make any. I play golf with Dave. I'm not going to make any comment. Anybody here? No.
For those who don't know me, I'm Frank Cody, and I happen to live with a bike rider, which he does among other things, and I thought this would be a good time for him to listen to someone who takes on long distances just by legs, not with helps. But Terry O'Connor is with me, Dr. Terry O'Connor, who has been resident with me in the same apartment building for, I guess it's getting close to 20 years now, but he and his wife are moving out, and we're very sad about that. Terry and I also taught together at after retirement from our respective professions, and we taught at Spring Arbor, University of Phoenix, or still is the University of Phoenix, and I think Terry was also teaching at Davenport and maybe somewhere else, but mostly business courses, and but probably some other specialties as well. So glad to have Terry with me.
I am so very happy to introduce my amazing grandson, Dallas Walters, and his fiance. They're going to be married in how many days? 37 days. I'm so blessed to have them and her family. And they did the Camino with my husband, who is my third guest, our speaker, my husband of 55 years, Jim Walters, and how lucky am I?
Have I covered everybody? I think I have. We have some sort of items of business we need to just mention fairly quickly. You remember the last meeting we were talking about the proposal we had to finance, if you will, getting new members. And I don't know when anybody has followed up that if you can get a new member, we will give you a semester of tuition off your dues, okay? And I just hope some people will follow up on that. Because we need I hate to say it, looking around, we need some new, younger blood to come in.
Okay, I think we're okay now.
Okay, I better stay away from here, right?
Stay away from that guy.
Oh, God, okay, so where should I be?
Right about.
Right about here? Okay, here I am. The second thing, important issue, is we elected, new officers, et cetera, last month, and I had to take on a role of, quote, of interim program director, vice president. And it's getting grayer. And I've done it, and we need to have some people step up and replace me as, quote, interim. I would suggest, at the least, if you could get together a team of some of your friends and say, if you can come up with a program, which would be, that would be 22, 23, that we need to have a new program for that time. If we don't, we're in trouble. We need to have people come up with new programs, and you can't rely on the old fish in here, okay? We've got to do it. So if you don't want to take it on solely, consider the possibility of joining up with one or two other people and have a beer and wine, excuse me. Have a beer and see if you can come up with some ideas. I got some ideas about some different things that relate to politics and media, but how they do things. But anyway, that's it. The last thing before we get on the program, Connie Turner, could you talk about Joe Reich, please? What?
Well, I just found out tonight that Joe Reich is in the Upjohn Rehabilitation Center for 3 weeks. He's waiting on hip surgery. He fell several times and repeatedly injured his hip. He has a broken hip. So it's going to be a complete replacement. And so I'm taking donations, and we're going to send flowers, and I will find out if he can have any visitors and calls, and then I'll coordinate with Jim, and we'll send an email out on what's happening. So if you want to donate, just drop it off the cash right there, and I'll take names, and of course I'm going to sign the whole club's name, so, but just give me the money, and I'm going to Vegas. I don't know, but it's been happening. The last time we saw him, he wasn't in good shape. And he didn't know his hip was broken and kept walking on it and had repeated falls. So it's really a tragic injury. So. Okay, thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Connie. One last thing, talking about the programs, and I'm kind of excited about this as a lawyer who deals with some of these divorce cases around. Ross Stancati, as a mediator, Ross Stancati is going to present in September on the Family Court Administration Board. What's exciting is Steve Gorsalis, who has been in there for, 20 years as a judge in there, is going to do the program with him. And more than 50% of any lawsuit in Kalamazoo and just about anywhere else are divorce cases or family law cases. So it's probably an extremely important area. And it's interesting to know how it affects the lives of the community. So, am I on the right track, Ross? Oh, never mind. You know the topic here, okay? And let's just go first on a quick run through on what Jim sent me for a bio. He's from, was it Wyandotte? Is that the proper pronunciation?
Wyandotte, Michigan, yes.
Wyandotte, married to Barbara, 2 kids, 5 grandchildren. He has a bachelor's in electrical engineering from Michigan, master's from Cal State, LA. He worked in the aerospace industry, designing space-based electronics, taught high school math, physics and chemistry, of one unusual place, not Portage. It was the Catholic mission in Malawi, East Africa. Okay. So, and he managed the advanced product engineering department at Allen Test Products, played basketball and baseball, and he's a big bicyclist, I know that. Speaks fluent Spanish, and it sounds like a...
No, not fluent. Nope, not fluent in Spanish. Some Spanish.
I learned to speak, what's the language, Chickawa? It sounds like an
Chichewa.
Indian. Chichewa, okay. And he's past president of Open Doors. He made the mistake of running for state senate in Van Buren County. But he served on the board of canvassers in Van Buren, past president for the Center for Transportation, and he's now active Center for Transformation mentor. And he's done this particular walk twice. Now, what I'm going to find fascinating about it is, was it 500 miles?
Yep.
There was a walk that occurred here in the States. It goes on all the time. And a man by the name of Bill Bryson wrote a book. Anybody remember it? It's called A Walk in the Woods. And it's about the trip that he did going up the Appalachian. Now, you're not going to find too many medieval cathedrals on the Appalachian Trail, but he found one heck of a lot of really strange characters in that book, and it's really, really hysterical. So I warned Jim, give us a feed on some of those characters that you had.
Will do.
All right? Thank you. You got your mic over there?
I've got a mic here. So I want to start with a disclaimer. This bad foot of mine has nothing to do with the Camino de Santiago, and it's temporary, so I'll be on my feet again shortly. Anyway, this is the Camino de Santiago. It's called the Way of St. James. It's an ancient pilgrimage route to the town of Santiago de Compostela in the northwest corner of Spain. It's named after James, the apostle of Jesus, who after witnessing Jesus' death, like all the other apostles, set out to convert the known world to Christianity. James made his way through France and Spain, founding little Christian communities all along the way, and ended up on the very west coast of Spain, near a place called Finisterre, which means the end of the earth, which at that time that's what they thought was the end of the earth. But years later, he decided to go back to Jerusalem. And as it turned out, King Herod's son, and Herod and Pilate had condemned Jesus to death. King Herod's son was in power, and when he heard that James the Christian was in town, he had him arrested, and in the year 44 AD, had James beheaded. Well, from there on, it's legend. Legend has it that the remains of St. James were carried back to the west coast of Spain and to his westernmost mission, a place called Compostela, which means field of stars. And he was buried there. Now, according to the legend and the history of the Camino, a shepherd named Pelayo discovered his separated head and body in the year 814 AD during the reign of King Alfonso. And informed about this, King Alfonso built a small shrine there to honor St. James. Now, as word spread of the shrine of St. James, more and more people made pilgrimages to visit that holy place. So in 1075, they began the construction of the cathedral that still stands there today in Santiago. And increasing numbers of peregrinos or pilgrims began to make their way. And so it became customary for the pilgrims that made their trip to Santiago, which was on, like I say, the west coast of Spain, to bring back with them a clamshell as a signal of the fact that they had completed their Camino and reached the ocean. So each peregrino, when you start your Camino, you go to the pilgrim office and you receive a clamshell. You put the clamshell on the back of your backpack, and that identifies you as a pilgrim walking the Camino. So gradually, like I say, the clamshell became the symbol of the Camino. And this is the clamshell. This is the sign that you see that marks the trail along the path that we follow. Now, as Christians from the 9th century on made pilgrimages to visit that resting place of St. James, a network of routes developed through Spain, Portugal, and France. Pope Calixtus II in the 12th century became a great proponent of those pilgrimages. And around 1140 AD, he actually wrote a guide for the pilgrims, how to get to Santiago. And that guide is still really considered the resource for modern guidebooks that talk about the Camino. And Pope Calixtus authored this prayer for peregrinos on their way to Santiago. He said, and I'm quoting, "God, you called your servant Abraham from Ur in Chaldea, watching over him in all his wanderings, and guided the Hebrew people as they crossed the desert. Guard these your children, who for love of your name make a pilgrimage to Compostela. Be their companion on the way, their guide at the crossroads, their strength in weariness, their defense in dangers, their shelter on the path, their shade in the heat, their light in the darkness, their comfort in discouragement, and the firmness of their intentions, that through your guidance they may arrive safely at the end of their journey, and enriched with grace and virtue, may return to their homes filled with salutary and lasting joy." That ancient prayer is printed in the credencial, the pilgrim's passport that we carry to identify you as a pilgrim, and allows you entrance into the low-cost albergues that are specifically for the pilgrims. So over the centuries, more and more pilgrims made their way to Santiago, and many of the little towns and Christian communities created these little albergues, they're called, low-cost housing for the peregrinos that were making their way to Santiago. And the most commonly used route for Europeans became the Camino Francais, which is the one that was on the original map there, starting in Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port in France and traversing 500 miles to Santiago de Compostela in the northwest corner of Spain. And that's the Camino that I walked. Now, who walks the Camino? Well, people come from all over the world. Asia, Europe, North America, South America, etc. Catholics, Protestants, Jews, Muslims, everything. Every imaginable person that you can think of. And why? Well, that's a good question, but there's many, many reasons. Many come for some spiritual growth, for solitude, for healing, some as atonement for some dark time in their life, in honor of a loved one, and some just for the adventure. Meeting other pilgrims, or peregrinos they're called in Spain, and hearing their stories is what draws many back to walk the Camino over and over again. I walked the Camino based on the recommendation of a friend, Eddie Martin, that Barb and I met while working at a mission school in Malawi, East Africa. Eddie now lives in France, and he walks sections of the Camino every summer. And he kept pestering me, basically. He said, "You got to do this, Walters. You got to walk this Camino." He said, "It'll be a transformative experience." And he recommended I watch the Martin Sheen movie, The Way, which I did. And it gives a pretty good picture of what it's like to walk the Camino. And then after watching the movie, I decided to take Eddie's advice. And so I made the arrangements. I flew to Paris, took 3 trains to Saint-Jean in the southern part of France, and then set out on my 500-mile Camino. Now, This was in 2013. So I followed the itinerary suggested in this John Brierley book, which is here. It offers a meditation to start each day, plus information about points of interest, where to stay, and typically it's a 15 to 20 mile walk each day, and according to if you follow the Brierley schedule, it takes about 33 days to complete the 500 miles. Now the first day's walk from Saint Jean to Roncesvalles in Spain, you cross the border from France into Spain, and I walked with a Canadian, actually, a guy named Al Peach that I met on the train ride from Paris to Saint John. High up in the Pyrenees, though, Al got really exhausted, and fortunately I had some energy bars with me, and I gave him an energy bar, and he got his strength back and was able to continue. Well, then we reached the descent. You climb about 5,000 feet in this first day, and then you descend about 1,500 feet into Roncesvalles. And in the descent, my legs all cramped up, so I was having a heck of a time. And all of a sudden, this young woman showed up from nowhere, a Danish woman, said she was a physical therapist. She could help me. She massaged my calves, gave me a bunch of water, and sure enough, I was good to go. So she was kind of like my little guardian angel that day. And I never saw her again after that. Yeah. So I finally reached Roncesvalles, and they had a communal dinner for all the peregrinos that arrived there. And so I sat with 4 women that I met there, Donna, Molly, Dolly, and Kim, all members of the same Catholic parish in Oklahoma. Donna was already suffering from the long trek from St. John, and she had a bad knee and I understood that she only completed about 2 days and then had to go home. Now Dolly, who's in her late 50s, at some point, she related this story. She says, well, she was in college, she met her husband, she put him through college, she put him through medical school, she helped him set up a very successful medical practice, and she had 9 children, and after all that, he divorced her for a young nurse. So, but she did add, my oldest daughter became an attorney, and together we sued his fanny off for child support. So, and I found out later the next day that Kim, walking by herself, came across a young German woman that we had met in La Rosuana. And she was sitting and crying beside the path. She had terrible blisters on both feet and just could not continue. She said she could go no further, but Kim bandaged her feet, lent her some flip-flops, and slowly they walked together to the next albergue. I came to realize that events like that are common on the Camino. Already having helped Al with the energy bar, the Danish girl helping me with my leg cramp, Kim helping the German girl with her blisters, and only a few days had passed. Strangers really take care of strangers on the Camino. There's some kind of awareness that we're all on a path to some new place. Strangers in a strange land, strangers to each other. And that helping and being helped by other peregrinos is integral to that journey. To this day, with it being so hard and physically demanding, I still find it amazing that everybody I know that's walked the Camino would like to do it again. After a couple more days, I met a Canadian woman, a French-Canadian woman, about 50 years of age from Ottawa, who walked at a pace similar to mine, so we walked together for quite a long time. And we followed a road crossing stone bridges built by the Romans, and the road built by the Romans who had first come to that Iberian Peninsula in 8 BC in a battle with the Carthaginians to control that area, a war that lasted some 12 years, and after that, Spain became then part of the Holy Roman Empire and stayed that way for about 400 years until the barbarian invasions some 400 years later. Monique and I talked about walking in the footsteps of these Roman soldiers from 2,000 years earlier, and about how humbling it was to walk the same ground that thousands of peregrinos had walked for hundreds of years before us, and about all the lost stories and unknown events that must have led to those pilgrimages. At some point, I asked Monique why she was walking the Camino, and she told me this amazing story. She said, I'm walking in Thanksgiving for a miracle in my life. And I'm going to quote her now, roughly quote her, let's say. She said, when I was 35, I was pregnant with my third child. At Christmas time, my husband and I traveled to my father's home in Montreal. I thought it might be the last time I saw him because he was suffering from terminal cancer. He'd been diagnosed with terminal cancer. I decided, she said, to go to the midnight mass on Christmas Eve. Saw that a priest was hearing confessions, and so I decided to go to confession before Mass. She said, I offered my confession, asked for forgiveness, and there was a long silence. But finally, the priest said, your sins are forgiven, but somehow I feel compelled to tell you that for your penance, you must simply make a wish, a serious wish that you pray about. That will be your penance. So Monique, she said, I left the confessional kind of stunned, never having experienced anything like that. But I thought and prayed about that wish through that Mass, and the next day, Christmas Day. And the next day I told my father about my strange midnight Mass confession and my wish and my prayer. I told him that I prayed that he would be a big influence on my children, including the one still in my womb. And my father, he looked at me and says, Monique, you know what the story is here. I'm terminally ill. There's nothing they can do for me. And she said, well, Dad, I'm sorry, but that was my prayer. So anyway, the next day, her father says, you know, Monique, I've been thinking about your prayer. My best friend, his son is a surgeon. I'll give him a call and see what if he can see me. So he called his friend. The surgeon agreed to see him, and 2 weeks later, he's in the operating room. He had the surgery, and the surgeon comes out and says to Monique, he said, I just don't know what to tell you. He said, all my medical training tells me your dad should not still be alive. I don't know how he has survived this long. I did everything I could, but the prognosis is not good. I'm so sorry. Then Monique stopped walking, and she just looked at me and said, my dad lived another 10 years, and he was a big influence in the lives of my children. He died not long after my youngest son's 10th birthday. I'm walking the Camino in Thanksgiving for the last 10 years of my dad's life. I still get it. Amazing story. Anyway, Monique offered to cook dinner that night at the albergue and asked if any others would like to participate. Well, 13 of us from 9 different countries said yes, each one volunteering to cook or clean up or shop. And one of the participants was a young man from Austria named Andreas. I asked Andreas why he was walking the Camino, and he told me that he was recovering from a terrible tragedy and walking to get his head on straight. 5 years earlier, he said, when he was 18, he was in a car with his mother, father, younger sister, and brother, and they were in a terrible accident, and they were all killed but him. And since then, he'd been grappling with that horrible tragedy, trying to make some sense of why he was still alive and what his life could possibly be after that. And I was really at a loss for words of what to say to him. I just said, geez, I just hope the Camino provides you the answers you're seeking. And even today, when I think about Andreas, I recall a quote from the Camino that says, sometimes you find yourself in the middle of nowhere, and sometimes in the middle of nowhere, you find yourself. And to this day, I hope those words prove true for Andreas. The next day, another hot one. Monique and I walked most of the day together, and that evening went to dinner with a guy named Marcelo. He was a Brazilian, about mid-30s, and a French couple who spoke no English or Spanish, and Monique and I. And it was just a hilarious dinner, trying to share our stories despite the language differences, alternating between French, English, Portuguese, and Spanish. So it was quite an evening. But Marcelo related this story. He said, my wife and I were married in our early 20s. We really wanted children, but it just did not happen. So in our late 20s, we decided to make a novena, attending Mass the first Friday of every month for 9 months, praying that we would have a child. And I promised that if I had a child, I would walk the Camino de Santiago from Saint Jean all the way to Santiago de Compostela. He says, well, here I am. He's 3 years old. He says, he cried when I left, and he asked me not to go, but I told him I had to go to keep a promise I made before he was born. So the next morning, I was about to set out from the albergue. Monique was standing near the door. She put her hand on my shoulder, said her Camino was over, and started crying. She said she had gotten terribly sunburned the last 2 days, was suffering from sun poisoning, and just could not continue. Her Camino was over. She was going home. We had shared a lot those last few days, and I felt really terrible for her, but we said goodbye, and I left. A few days later, my right knee began to really bother me, and I walked 3 more days after that, but finally could not continue. I went to a hospital. They told me my Camino was over too. So at that point, I joined roughly the 50% of the people that start in St. John and never make it to Santiago. Now, I'm going to fast forward 4 years. After recovering from my second knee replacement, I announced to Barb, now I've got 2 knees made of steel. I'm going to walk the Camino one more time. But when my grandson Dallas, sitting right here, heard about my plan, he said, well, Grandpa, you can't do that by yourself. I got to go with you. And then Jordan, his fiance, says, well, Dallas, you can't leave me for 6 weeks. I got to go too. So that's the way they agreed to pay their own way there and back, and so that's what happened. So the rest of this is about my second Camino, along with Jordan and Dallas. So here we are at my house, getting ready to go. We left in early June of 2017 during their summer break from college. We flew from Chicago to Boston to Paris and connected with to connect with the Eurorail reservations I'd made. But the plane was late, and we ended up getting very late to Saint Jean, not till at about 10:15 p.m. after the hostel I had reserved had already closed. We were just exhausted after some 31 hours of travel and wandered down the dark streets of Saint John, found an auberge, it's called an auberge in France, still with an open door, and awakened the French owner, who then offered us a small room with 4 bunks. He asked why we had arrived so late in Saint Jean, gave us some food, and then, in just a beautiful French accent, captivated us as he talked about the Camino with great feeling and emotion, emphasizing what a transformative experience it would be if we surrendered ourselves to the Camino and let it work its magic. It was such a beautiful soliloquy, a beautiful start to our great pilgrimage, and he offered some advice as well. He said, well, first of all, he welcomed us to Saint Jean, starting point for the Camino Francais. He said, you're about to begin an incredible journey. Share your story, why you have come. Be attentive to the stories of others, and take care of your feet. Help others when you can, and receive help graciously. And don't be discouraged by the hardships. The Camino will provide. So the next day, we went to the pilgrim office, which is easy to find because they got a couple of worn out boots hanging above the door. And there you receive your clamshell that identifies you as a pilgrim, and your credencial that you get stamped at every place you stop along the way. And that ends up being the proof that you walk the Camino and allows you to get your credencial, you get your Compostela when you arrive in Santiago. Our first day, we followed what's called the Route of Napoleon, the path Napoleon's army had taken to invade Spain in May of 1808, a total of 17 miles, including a climb of about 5,000 feet, and then followed by a 1,500-foot descent into Roncesvalles in Spain. Almost immediately, we faced our first crisis. Jordan was exhausted from our travel, little sleep, lack of food, and the strenuous climb, and threw up several times. But finally, we reached Orisson, the first albergue. It's only about a third of the way where we were trying to go, and it's still in France, but Jordan just could not continue. I talked to the owner of the auberge, and he suggested we could call a taxi to come get Jordan take her back to Roncesvalles in Spain, have her catch a bus from there. Take her back to Saint Jean in France, and then take a bus to Roncesvalles in Spain, where Dallas and I were going. And I was thinking, oh my God, I'm going to send this pretty young woman by herself who speaks no Spanish, no French, back to Saint Jean. Un poquito, okay. Back to Saint Jean, and then she's got to get a bus to Roncesvalles in Spain. Oh man, this is just a recipe for disaster. But anyway, we had no alternative, so that's what we did. So meanwhile, Dallas and I set out for Roncesvalles, and I was slower than Dallas, so he walked ahead on his own. And high up in the mountains, I stopped beside another peregrino, a mid-30s guy named Robert from Germany. He mentioned that he had driven 20 straight hours from his home in Germany to Saint Jean, and without any sleep had started this really grueling walk to Roncesvalles. I must have looked a little shocked. So then he said, my wife took her clothes, which made no sense to me. And I said, you mean she's going on vacation while you're walking the Camino? He said, no, she took our 2 kids, she left me. My life is a mess. I'm walking the Camino to try and make some sense of what my future is. So we talked a little bit more, and I expressed my condolences for the struggles he was experiencing. But as I got up to leave, he insisted that I take an energy bar. He says, for the journey, take it for the journey. So I did, and I put it in my backpack. But because of our late start and all the delays and working out arrangements for Jordan at the auberge and Horizon, the sun was low in the sky as I made the steep rocky descent into Roncesvalles. When between the tough climb earlier in the day and the lack of food, I was getting a little woozy, and I really needed some food. And then I remembered Robert had given me the energy bar. So I had the energy bar, and I was able to continue. And as I was walking, I remembered the French auberge owner's advice, the Camino will provide. And I thought, finally, we reached this huge albergue in Roncesvalles. I arrived late, about 7:30 p.m., and reconnected there with Dallas and Jordan, who had made it by bus. Dallas and I were exhausted, but Jordan, on the other hand, was really excited to tell us about 4 new female friends she had made on the trip, on the bus ride from Roncesvalles, all peregrinos like her, one from Venezuela, one from Florida, one from Australia, one from Detroit. So in the morning, we set out for the beautiful little town of La Rosuana on the edge of a river. But on the way, Jordan was sick again. She just hadn't been eating very much. A Spanish peregrino we walked with, a guy named Juan Trevino, seeing Jordan in such distress, insisted that Dallas put Jordan's pack on his front. And so Dallas carried Jordan's pack on his front and his pack on his back down this steep, rocky incline into Zubiri. And I got to say, I came to really admire Dallas that day, both for his strength and just for his kindness in dealing with all the struggles that Jordan was going through. The next day, we entered the town of La Rosuana. We recognized the bridge where Martin Sheen had been sitting in the movie, The Way, so we sat there too. That's when Martin Sheen's backpack fell off the bridge into the river. We had a snack there and reconnected with Juan Trevino, the Spaniard. Once again, Jordan was feeling sick and couldn't go on. Juan was concerned about Jordan's sickness and knee problem and gave us an emergency number that we could call from anywhere in Spain. We found an albergue, and they agreed to arrange a taxi for Jordan, so we taxied her ahead to where Dallas and I were walking. By the next day, Jordan's knee was bothering her, but she insisted she could walk to our next destination, Puente la Reina, the Queen's Bridge. It was a day we would climb to the Alto del Perdón, the Mount of Forgiveness. It's a high, beautiful spot with some metal statuary erected in tribute to the thousands of peregrinos that pass by each day. So I was hopeful that she could make that trek despite her knee problems, the 13 miles we needed to walk in the 1,200-foot climb we were facing. And we again ran into Juan, who walked with us and kept saying to Jordan, despacito, despacito, slowly. But Jordan toughed it out, and she made it to the top, and we rested there with some other peregrinos. The metal sculptures and the incredible vistas from that point make the tough climb really worth it. The next day, once again, we had to send Jordan ahead by bus. Dallas and I walked past this old Benedictine monastery in Irache, where in addition to a fountain of fresh water, the Benedictines also make available a fountain of wine, where peregrinos can fortify themselves for the journey ahead. So in keeping with tradition, of course, we decided to do that as well. For most of that first week, Jordan would start out walking with us each morning, but at some point was unable to continue, so we put her on a bus or a taxi to our next destination. However, after day 7, you go through tiny little towns that have no bus service, and it was getting very challenging. So I said to Dallas, Dallas, this just isn't working for Jordan. I think we're going to have to send her home to Paris, back to Paris and then home. And Dallas reluctantly agreed. And so that evening I sat down with Jordan and I said, Jordan, this just isn't working. We're going to places where we can't taxi you. I think we're going to have to send you home. And she burst into tears and started crying because with all her difficulty, she was having the time of her life. She was having a great time. And finally, she straightened up, looked me in the eye and said, no, I am not going home. I will walk from now on. And that's what she did. From that time on, she walked every step of the way. And she started, she was kind of a little bit of a picky eater before that, and she wasn't replenishing the calories she needed. So finally, we got her to eat. She ate paella, the traditional Spanish dish, made mostly of rice, but with some other unknown to her meats and vegetables. And she even ate pulpo, the octopus, and drank cerveza with limon, beer with lemonade. So finally, we got her, going. The weather prediction for the next day was really marginal, and so we all decided to take a bus, and we bused to Burgos, the site of this huge cathedral, beautiful cathedral, and gave ourselves a rest day, allowing time to tour the cathedral and see some of the gorgeous artwork. The remains of El Cid, the Christian knight, warrior, and national icon who helped drive the Moors out of Spain, is interred there, along with many other historical figures. After Burgos, some of the interior of the cathedral. After Burgos comes the Meseta, the high plains and vast farms, almost void of any trees. And the temperatures in those days, that day we were facing a European heat wave, so it was almost 100 degrees every day. And so we started early, and somewhere along the line we ran, I think this may have been from my first, somebody carved a little smiley face in one of the sunflowers there. We passed fields of sunflowers. And we walked through ancient villages and onto Castro Jerez, where I had been forced to abandon my first Camino 4 years earlier. After 6 more days and staying in tiny little villages, we reached the huge city of Leon, where we stayed in a large albergue run by nuns. The square and the streets were packed, and people were celebrating some kind of festival, as happens almost every weekend during the summer in Spain. And we ran into 4 kids from Pittsburgh that we had met earlier, who had just graduated from a small Catholic high school together and were walking the Camino before they all went their separate ways in the fall. And when we returned to the albergue, I reconnected with a Japanese fellow I had met, a guy named Hiyotaka Iwasaki. He had studied in the U.S., taught philosophy at a university in Japan, and like me, had decided to walk the Camino after his retirement. He told me that he was a descendant of the few Catholics that had survived the persecution and near extinction of Christianity in Japan. How St. Francis Xavier had come to Japan in 1549 from Portugal to preach Christianity. How he founded multiple Christian missions. Subsequently, Portuguese soldiers were sent to protect the missions, and how the Japanese interpreted that as an invasion of their country and began to systematically exterminate anyone who identified with Christianity. He recommended I watch the Liam Neeson movie called Silence, and I did that, and it was disturbing, let's say. From Lyon, we walked on to Astorga, site of another beautiful cathedral. Construction there began in 1741 on the site of a previous 11th century Romanesque cathedral. The exterior and the interior are just incredible. There's a chapel to St. James. Later that day, walking alone, a sharp pain suddenly shot up my left leg from the ankle to the knee. I thought, oh no, not again. I know, and I was really afraid that my second Camino was going to end prematurely. I managed to limp to the next village and found Dallas and Jordan waiting and told them what had happened. So I got a taxi to the next albergue, El Pilar, at the town of Rabanel del Camino. I was really worried, however, that my Camino might be over. But pain and hardship on the Camino always seemed to be overcome with joy. At this albergue, Pilar, we reconnected with peregrinos we had met previously, had a really nice evening with them. And this photo shows Sophie, who you'd seen earlier with Jordan. And she had just graduated from Bowdoin College in Maine and was walking the Camino before she started a job with the Rand Corporation in the fall. And that's Sirica from Australia, me, and Maria from Mexico. The next day's walk is one of the highlights of the Camino. Peregrinos pass the Cruz de Ferro, the Iron Cross, a replica of the original kept in the cathedral in Astorga. For hundreds of years, peregrinos, following tradition, have brought stones from their home country or mementos of their loved ones and left there at the foot of the Iron Cross. I wanted to walk that day, but my leg was killing me and I just couldn't do it. So I taxied ahead to a hospital. At the hospital in Ponferrada, my injury was diagnosed as simply a pulled muscle, so I was greatly relieved. I took some painkillers. Jordan kept after me, but when I was informed, or when I learned of my diagnosis, I went to the desk in the hospital and to pay, and I was informed that on the Camino, peregrinos are treated gratis, no charge. So, cost me nothing. The next day, from Villafranca, we walked to this little town, Villafranca del Bierzo. And it's just a gorgeous little town on a river. And the day after that, we walked to Osobrero, which is one of the toughest days. It's a climb of another 2 tough climbs and 22 miles in distance. But the scenery and the flowers and the forests and the valleys were just incredibly beautiful and kept us going. And finally, around 4 p.m., after walking from sunup, we reached the municipal albergue near the outer edge of town. It was big, with 104 beds in one big room. But to our pleasant surprise, the 4 Pittsburgh kids were there, right with beds right beside ours. There was a monastery in Osobrera. The Pittsburgh kids invited us to go with them to participate in the night prayers and chanting of the monks at the monastery, and then join them for food afterwards. The prayers and chanting were really inspiring, and the camaraderie we shared with the Pittsburgh kids capped off another fabulous day. The next day, Dallas and Jordan once again walked ahead, and I was by myself. At some point, I came to a little shady spot with huge boulders, and the Pittsburgh kids were there. As they did every day, they had stopped for their daily prayers, and as I approached, they asked me to join them, which I did. Sean, who in September begin studying for the priesthood, had an app on his phone with meditations for the day, and we passed that phone around as we sat there on the big boulders, each one of us reading a part of that meditation for the day. I felt really honored that those 4 high school kids had invited me to share that time with them. the next day took us to Sevilla, just over 100 kilometers, 62 miles from Santiago. The pilgrim office in Santiago gives a Compostela, I've got right here, to anybody that walks the last 100 kilometers or 62 miles to Compostela. And at that time, by that time, Jordan's knee was killing her and my feet were killing me with blisters, but we knew we had to walk that last little bit in order to qualify for our Compostela. So, but from Sevilla on, the Camino is very, very different. It's almost, you know, in the first part, up till that time, you're largely by yourself or with a very few people. From Sevilla on, it's almost like a parade. There are people from many different countries, speaking many different languages, going on all around you, French, Spanish, Slovakian, just about every language you can imagine. And walking from Sevilla, I met a Spanish gentleman named Janice, who was a teacher and chaperoning a group of high school kids from Barcelona during their summer vacation as they made their Camino from Sevilla to Santiago. He asked me where I had started my Camino, and I told him from Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port across the Pyrenees in France. He stopped, shocked. He looked me over and said, "How old are you?" And I told him, well, as chance would have it, I expected to arrive in Santiago on my 74th birthday. And once again, he looked shocked. But we continued walking and talking and eventually stopped for a break at a little restaurant bar along the way. And a group of his students were there. So he told them about me, and several gathered around to have their pictures taken with me. The old guy, and their teacher, Janice. He gave me a little green bracelet as a token of our new friendship. The student group had a sag wagon that would meet them occasionally when they crossed a major road or entered a small town. So after our first meeting, whenever I would pass their sag wagon and the students having their snacks, they would stand up and applaud. I had become a celebrity on the Camino. Janice had told me that he had asked each of his students to not just spend time walking with their friends, but to spend time with someone from another country and give away the little green bracelets that they all carried as a sign of friendship. I was lucky that 3 of his students walked with me, each at different times. Their English was better than my Spanish, but we alternated between the languages, and I was really impressed with their intelligence, their grasp of worldwide issues, and their plans for the future. Our second day out of Sevilla, we met a group of students from the Philippines, chaperoned by a young 20-something guy from Argentina, Sebastiano. And Sebastiano and I walked together for a while, and I asked him how he got connected with these kids from the Philippines. He said, well, I'm a volunteer at a Catholic mission high school in the Philippines, and I'm chaperoning these kids as they walk the Camino during our summer holiday. He said, my father in Argentina owns several businesses, and our family is extremely wealthy. He said, in my early 20s, I lived a life of debauchery, wine, women, song, parties. He said, but no matter how much I partied and caroused with my friends, I was never happy. There was always this aching in my heart. I felt that my life really had no purpose, and my existence on this earth was meaningless. So eventually, with my parents' blessing, I decided to volunteer at a mission in the Philippines. It was there I found my calling. I've now enrolled in the seminary, and starting in September, will begin the process of becoming a priest. For the first time in my life, I feel there is some meaning for my existence, and I am happier now than I've ever been. After we parted that day, I never saw Sebastiano again, but to this day, his story of finding his way still moves me. What a great blessing it was for me to be there on the Camino on that day with Sebastiano and to hear his story. Finally, on our last day, we reached the great monument to peregrinos on the mountain overlooking the entry into Santiago. Once again, the Barcelona kids were there, so I managed to get a picture with many of them. That's me with the blue shirt and the gray hair, as if you couldn't figure that out. And Janice, the teacher, kneeling in front of me. As we entered the city, a young woman, Victoria from Austria, who somehow had heard about this 74-year-old Peregrino walking all the way from St. Jean, approached me and asked if she could have her picture taken with me. I agreed, of course, somewhat thrilled at my newfound celebrity status. We arrived in Santiago late in the afternoon and went to the Cathedral Square, which was buzzing with lots of Peregrinos celebrating their completion of their Camino and arrival in Santiago. The next day, my 74th birthday, we went to the pilgrim office and stood in line to get our Compostelas, the document recommending or recognizing our completion of the Camino. Many of the Peregrinos we had met along the way were there also. Amy from Ireland, Camilla from Sweden, the Pittsburgh kids, and many others. Lots of laughs and hugs and photos were exchanged. As I stepped up to the clerk that would issue my Compostela and presented him with my credencial documenting my Camino, I mentioned that it was my 74th birthday, which he loudly announced. And all 14 clerks, plus a whole bunch of Peregrinos, sang happy birthday to me. Standing near me with another clerk was Sean, the soon-to-be seminarian from Pittsburgh. One of his buddies told the clerk that Sean was entering the seminary in the fall, so Sean's clerk arranged that he could serve as an altar boy at the next day's noon mass, a mass held every day in the cathedral in honor and recognition of the newly arriving Peregrinos. It was really neat to see Sean that following day, just before Mass, all clean-shaven in white robes, and help serve the Mass for Peregrinos that we all attended. At that Mass, the priest emphasized in his sermon, in a way, echoing the prayer of Pope Calixtus from the 12th century, that reaching Santiago de Compostela was not the end of our Camino, but the beginning of a new Camino for all of us, enriched by the experiences we had just completed. After the Mass, Peter, Dominic, Sean, Chuck, and I, the Pittsburgh kids, all climbed up the spiral staircase behind the altar, and following a tradition hundreds of years old, each gave the statue of St. James a big abrazo, a big hug. We spent that last day in Santiago reconnecting with Peregrinos we had met along the way from the U.S., Canada, Germany, Sweden, Ireland, all over the place. And that night, Dallas, Jordan, and I, plus the 4 Pittsburgh kids, all wandered down to the city park after a late dinner. Chuck spotted 3 young college girls that he had seen earlier in the day singing in the cathedral square. And he went over and asked them if they would sing for our little group of 7 American Peregrinos. They looked a little shocked, but agreed to do it. And so they sang the Beatles song yesterday in gorgeous harmony. And they sang so beautifully that a crowd gathered around. So they sang 2 more songs for us. And I remember looking around and thinking, here I am, my 74th birthday, on a warm summer night in Santiago, Spain, having just walked the 500-mile Camino Francés in a park with Jordan, with Dallas, my grandson, and 4 kids from Pittsburgh that have become friends. I think I'm in heaven. And being serenaded by these 3 young Spanish senoritas. And so ends my tale of the Camino de Santiago. Thank you for allowing me to share it with you.
Thank you. That was terrific. Before we go into questions, I want you to take a look around and see just how full this room is. This has been the Annus Horribilis, and I remember when we first got together, I guess it was back in February, we'd have 3 people at a table and we'd have 4 tables or so in the whole place. So this is absolutely terrific that we have the kind of, we've got just about every single seat in the place is taken. That's absolutely great. And I hope when we come back here again in September that this will be the norm, that we can do this. This is terrific. I have to make a comment about your age.
Yes?
I have a friend from Gull Lake, he's a sailor. He died recently. He owned A.M. Todd. the spice company.
Sure.
In Winship Todd, Win Todd. In any case, he just passed away at the age of 104. And his favorite line was, "Oh, to be 90 again." So I just had my 80th birthday on the 4th of July, so all I can say is, "Oh, to be 74 again." All right. Let me ask one quick question. Being a cynic from the city, okay? You take a journey like this and you got a whole bunch of strangers, it seems like you're great targets for fraudsters.
It really isn't a problem. I mean, sometimes you go through big cities like Pamplona, and if you're in a crowd, you got to be careful. I mean, you keep your, make sure a pickpocket or something doesn't get you. But generally, you're out in the boonies, and there's never a problem. You're sleeping in a big room a lot of times with bunches of people, and I've never heard of any problem
I'm just
occurring.
thinking of beggars and things of that nature.
Real quick, when Jim had his first Camino that ended because he broke his fib, basically, I ended up in Santiago by myself because we already had arrangements and it was too late for me to change. I was by myself for five days in Santiago. I was 60-something-year-old woman by myself walking around at night because that's what time we can get dinner. Never had a problem. And this was a big city. I mean, I felt so safe. And everyone had, I was safe.
Okay, that's great to hear. Don't go downtown Kalamazoo at night, right? Do I have any questions out here I can go to?
Sure.
You were mentioning, I think it was Saria is about 62 miles away.
Yes.
Now, if I were, and I'm not planning it, Jim, but if I were to go to Saria and walk to I think it's
Santiago de Compostela.
Santiago, yeah. Would I get a Compostela just for that 62
You
mile
would.
walk?
You would.
Okay.
The last 100 kilometers or 62 miles,
Okay.
anybody that walks that gets their certificate, the Compostela. It's in Latin, and in Latin, my name is Jacobum Walters.
Oh,
So
I like Jim better, but thank you.
yes,
Out here?
What time of the year, or is this right now?
Well, I went.
That they regularly, that the main pilgrimage.
It goes on all year round, even in the winter. Some people do it, although many of the albergues are not open in the winter. But there are peregrinos that do it even in the winter. I did my first one in September, which was just gorgeous because a lot of the little paths, there's wild berries that you can pick. But with Dallas and Jordan, we went in June because they were in college, so they had to go during their vacation time. And during the summer months, it's much more crowded. It's less crowded in the fall.
Sounded like it gets pretty hot in the summer if you go in midsummer.
Yes, it can.
Do we have any others? Questions? Now they can.
Okay. So we were there 4th of July, and they know that in America that's our Independence Day, and we were there. It was like the end of our journey, so it was very, very packed, and we went to this cafe, and it was super packed there. And the Pittsburgh guys were with us as well. Well, we had met this girl, her name's Alvita, and she was from Madrid, and she was walking the last 5 days with her mom. And she had mentioned out loud that we were from the States, and so everyone had asked us to sing the national anthem. So it was us and the Pittsburgh guys, and we, sang the national anthem. And I thought that was, very awesome because, that was cool because we got to sing, the national anthem in front of them, and then they, gave us a big applaud, and, it was crazy. But, yeah, that's just something that was really awesome as well on the journey.
Okay. Any other questions around?
I wanted to ask Jordan, when you were injured and there was a deliberation whether you would go home or not, what made you decide that you were going to continue? How was that deliberation? How would you characterize your deliberation and your choice?
So I was young, and to be honest, like Dallas and I had only trained one day. So honestly, we like everyone back home, like they were hopeful for us, but in all honesty, they were like expecting me to like go back home. So like the determination of just like not giving up. Well, that, and because like I did tore something in my leg, I don't know what it was. I didn't go to the doctors for it, but yeah, so they were just like, I was young and I wasn't like as fit as like, I mean, Jim walked every single day 14 miles like to the breakfast place or something, and we never walked. So I guess it was just like, yeah, the determination just kept me going. Like I really, really wanted to finish something and prove like I can do something, just not only because like I tore something in my leg or not because I'm a girl, but like I can do this.
A nice new idea may have been born. Coordinate the food with the topic. The gazpacho was a perfect touch.
Well, thank you all, and thank you, Jim, very much for what you've done.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Well,
I know Dallas really helped take care of Jim's feet every night toward the end, and that was huge. And also Dallas and Jordan really kept, you know, you would wait for him at the end. I mean, you were a wonderful support for him, and I'll never forget that.
well, there we have it. Thank you all for being here tonight, and look forward to seeing you in the third Wednesday of September. And we're going to